Ohayo, watashi wa Rishi desu. Onegai shimasu. The Heian period is a period of time that starts in 794 AD and continues until 1185 AD. It's a period of time categorized by peace and prosperity. And during this time period, they really expand their knowledge of science, culture, and the fine arts. Specifically, I'll be talking about the impact that women had on literature and in this historical period of time. First, I'll talk a little bit about the setting so you understand the culture during this time period, then about how language changed during the Heian period, and finally, I'll talk a little bit about the movers and shakers of the time. The rise, the fall, the life in between. Coming out of the Nara period, which is full of bloodshed, rebellion, and conflict, the rise of the Heian period is really set off by three main events. The first of which is the 50th Emperor of Japan, Emperor Kanmu, moving the capital to Heian, or what would later be known as Kyoto. It stays there for several centuries before it's moved to Edo, or what we know as Tokyo. The second of which is the rise of the Fujiwara clan. The Fujiwara clan at this time is starting out as a low-end aristocratic family, but it marries into the imperial family, and doing so takes control of the aristocracy and the government. The last of which, and perhaps the most important, is the Chinese rebellion that happens at the end of the 800s. Because Japan has just settled down and has just become peaceful, Japan is really reluctant to go back into battle, and in doing so, they decide to suspend all interaction with China. However, China had been heavily influencing Japan, having fingers in things like their government, their legal system, even as low as their farming system and their baseline culture. So Japan is forced at this point to develop their culture to a point that it self-sustains. These three events coming together are what really triggers the Heian period and enforces the want to not go to war anymore. Interestingly enough, life during the Heian period is a very interesting blend of constraints that you're not allowed to break for consequence of death and a large amount of freedoms. During this time period, there's many instances of men and women both having multiple partners, having relations freely, even illicit relations freely. The only rule was that you had to mind the constraints of the culture. So society, depending on your social and rank, had certain rules that you had to follow, such as how you dressed during certain seasons of the year, who you talked to, where you went. But as long as you minded all of these constraints, you were free to more or less do what you want as long as you were polite and discreet about it. Ironically, though, in spite of being a very heavily patriarchal society, women had a very heavy sway on the policies that come into place during this time period. The non-heir sons in this time period would go to live with their wives' families. This meant that unless you were the firstborn son of your family, you would go and live with your mother-in-laws and your father-in-laws. And as such, the mother-in-laws had a very heavy impact on what the sons would do. This meant that the future generals and politicians and economists were all very heavily swayed by what their mothers told them to do. However, following these guidelines and following the social stratification that society had at this time period meant that overall, your lives would be very peaceful and quiet. It was a time of peace and rest and exploration into the more delicate beauties of life. However, like all good things, it eventually had to come to an end. Much like the beginning of the Heian period, the fall of the Heian period is categorized by three main things. The first of which was Emperor Go-Sanjo. Emperor Go-Sanjo is the first emperor in about 400 years that doesn't have a Fujiwara mother. Because of this, he ends up pulling power away from the Fujiwara clan and pulling it back into himself. Doing so causes a lot of strife between clans because up until this point, the clans had basically been in charge. This causes several clans to have a bit of an issue with him. However, in the end, it all works out for about 20 years until his son comes onto the throne. When his son comes onto the throne, the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan both decide to rebel. And when they do so, the Fujiwara clan sides with the emperor. The Fujiwara clan and the emperor end up going to war, and with the Taira clan and the Minamoto clan, and the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan win. However, on the heels of this success, the Minamoto clan and the Taira clan go to war themselves. The Taira clan pulls a victory in this aspect, and the clan head goes on to basically run Japan for another 20 years or so. When he dies, the Minamoto clan once again goes to war with the Taira clan, this time winning, and then the Minamoto clan takes control. Basically, in the end, over the space of about 40 years, power goes from the Fujiwara clan to the Minamoto clan, and the Minamoto clan uses this to pull power more towards a militaristic lifestyle and opposed to a more aristocratic and peaceful lifestyle. The development of literature. This is going to talk a little bit about how literature changes over the space of 400 years. Previously, Japan had had really tight relations with China. However, when China ends up having the rebellion in the late 800s and Japan extracts itself from Chinese policies, they discover that they have certain issues. Previously, Japanese people spoke Japanese. However, those who were well learned enough to know how to write, which were few and far in between and primarily wealthy merchants and aristocrats, they wrote in Chinese as opposed to Japanese because there was no Japanese alphabet. Most of the things that you would learn day to day were in Japanese. However, if you went into higher level learning, it was all in Chinese. It was Chinese philosophy, Chinese education, so on and so forth. So when the Japanese government separates from the Chinese government, they end up having to completely remake their alphabet and make a Japanese writing system that they had never used before. These new written languages were called kana. Interestingly enough, kana has two different types. There's hiragana and katakana. Hiragana is considered the feminine hand. It's similar to cursive and it's pictured on the side. The feminine hand was used to write things like poetry, also known as waka in the Japanese language, whereas katakana was used to write legal documents and government documents. Typically speaking, hiragana was used by aristocratic ladies and men who chose to be scholars pursuing the fine arts, such as the Sanseki, who were three of the most prolific male poets of the time period. Interestingly enough, even though women were prolific poets during this period, men typically were the only ones who got recognition for it because it was considered to be a natural aspect of the female's life that she would write poetry and create beautiful art. Another interesting thing is that women during this time period, especially aristocratic women, would have a great deal of free time, and they would use this free time to pursue various amounts of fine arts, such as flower arranging, dress designing, painting, writing, calligraphy, so on and so forth. One of the more common pursuits of time was to write diaries, and now these diaries are a wellspring of information about court life. Three of the most prolific diaries, or the most pronounced and powerful diaries that we have today, that we have translated, are the Kaguro Diary, the Pillow Book, and the Diary of Lady Murasaki. The Kaguro Diary is a diary about an unnamed young woman who lives in the court life and is having domestic issues with her spouse. The Pillow Book is a book by Sei Sonaga, who is a very well-known poet and a courtier at the turn of the millennium. And then the Diary of Lady Murasaki is a diary, obviously, by Murasaki Shikabu. Murasaki Shikabu becomes a tutor for the Empress Consort at the time, and she becomes very powerful for it. But we'll talk about both of those two ladies later on. An interesting aspect about women in the Heian period is they had a lot of social rules that they had to follow, more so necessarily than men. One of the most interesting of these is their sense of style. So women would paint ink on their teeth to make them black because they believed that white teeth were similar to skinned caterpillars. Plumpness obviously was a sign of wealth and power. Long hair was also a sign of being feminine and not having to work, and having the longest hair you could was a sign of patience and femininity. There's stories of one woman who has hair that was 5 meters long. It was so long that as she walked through her home, it would trail behind her in the rooms she left. They also wore very complex outfits called junihito, which is a series of up to 12 kimonos stacked on top of each other. It weighed about 27 pounds. And it was all very specifically chosen for color, fabric, length, so on and so forth, to suit the season, a specific animal, flowers, and then of course your own personal preference. Having a clothes faux pas to wear the wrong thing would be the same as committing social suicide. And during this time, social suicide is very important because it can bring dishonor to your family and it can get you kicked out of the capital permanently. Once you have committed some sort of social faux pas, there's very little you can do to go back on it. Now to talk about those two women that I mentioned earlier. Sei Shonagon was born around 966 and lived until somewhere between 1017 and 1025. She was the author of the Pillow Book, as I mentioned previously, and served the empress from 993 to 1000 even. She was hailed from a family of waka poets, and she was renowned for using Chinese instead of hiragana, and was honestly looked down upon for it. However, she was known to be very shrewd and very logical. Many of the women in court during this time period and to follow her had a very poor opinion of her because she seemed too masculine. However, she was known to be extremely intelligent. She knew several languages, and she was a very prolific writer. And during her time period, especially in the Pillow Book, she writes thousands of poems. And in all of these poems, they're masterpieces of the syllabalism, the symbolism specifically. She's known for being one of the most amazing writers during this time period. In the end, she lives to be about 40 before the lead-based paint that ladies of court are expected to wear eats away not only at her health, but at her appearance. This is in the end what ends up driving her out of the court, alongside a change in power overall. Then we have Murasaki Shikabu. Murasaki Shikabu was born in 976-ish and lived to about 1026-ish. She writes the Tale of Genji, which is the first novel in Japanese history. It's about 53 chapters long, and it took her 10 years to write. It's all written in hiragana, which is a very long way to write it. It's very simple to write, but it takes a long time. She serves Empress Shoshi for 5 to 6 years as a tutor of sorts, and she is a firm believer that Sei Shonagon was a cruel and wicked woman. In the end, she also lives to be quite old and suffers a similar fate where the makeup and the toxins in their day-to-day lives ends up eating away at her appearance, and she goes to the countryside to live in her family manor. While she's in her family manor, though, she is still writing the Tale of Genji. The Tale of Genji, in the end, is one of the most amazing books, in my personal opinion, in Japanese history. It's about Genji, the estranged son of the emperor, and his various shenanigans as he maneuvers through adulthood. As you can see, women had a really heavy impact in society. They were the movers and shakers of the culture. And this is a time period of Japan where culture defined everything. the simple weight that the favor of one woman could hold is astronomical compared to society now. And when you take that also into consideration that many of these women were very intelligent and skilled writers, it really just puts into proportion the amount of weight that they really held in society. Thank you very much for listening to this far too long video, and I really hope that you find the topic to be interesting yourself as much so as it is for me.